And we're live. This is great. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate. Yeah, so take a sip. I appreciate you coming all this way. Yeah, first episode of the back row. We were talking about it before. Life in the back row is different when you're in class than if you're sitting in the front, and I've been both sides of it. Education, the student, and then the teacher of it. And life in the back row is just fun. So I was one of those kids. I think you said you always sat in the back row as well. Fantastic. I should say we're here with longtime friend, actually siblings, so very long time, my whole lifetime, Anna Beresford, and just super excited to get this kicked off. How are you feeling?
Feeling good. Excited.
Yeah.
Happy to chat. Yeah. Feeling really good.
Nice. This is great. This is one of those conversations, like I was trying to think of my first guest, and you were probably the top one, mainly because you've been doing your PhD for a while now, and people always ask me, they're like, oh, what's she studying? Why is she in this country? Why is she over here? And I've always had a bit of an answer, but never really a full answer. And I think we even spoke 2 years ago where I said, can you just give me one sentence of what you're studying so that when somebody asks me, I can tell them?
Mm-hmm.
And every time I get asked, I'm like, oh, I should sit down with her and talk about what she's actually studying. And then 4 years later, we're finally making it happen. So
perfect.
Take it away. You're doing your PhD. You
Yep.
would call yourself a PhD candidate.
Yep, that's
University
correct.
of Waterloo.
Yep.
Take it away. What are you studying?
Okay, so my PhD program, it's called a PhD in Social and Ecological Sustainability. So that can basically be anything to do, broadly speaking, with sustainability or how people operate or how animals, anything in the world, essentially, you can study under that huge umbrella.
Okay.
Very, very wide umbrella. So it's a transdisciplinary department. So we've got a lot of scientists, a lot of sociologists, all these different kind of from different areas. So that's the name of the PhD. It's at the University of Waterloo, and my PhD specifically, the tentative working title is a pattern language of traditional music for sustainable development.
Okay.
Now, it's a working title.
Yeah, hold me up. My biggest worry coming into this was that I wouldn't know what you were talking about. So can you give that to me again? A pattern language
of traditional music for sustainable development.
All right.
And that's the working title, because I'm sure it'll change at some point. And so what I'm looking at, I'll give you a brief kind of sentence and then give a larger explanation if that's...
Yeah,
okay.
I need a full explanation, yeah.
Excellent. So briefly, what I'm trying to do is identify what the patterns are, the structural elements are that go into setting up sustainable and vibrant traditional music cultures in specifically rural areas, but any area really, for the purposes of generating community life, building relationships, and kind of kickstarting the economy in those areas as well. And so that's what I'm looking at. What are the elements that are required? And so kind of political, social, family life, very specifically music education, all of these kind of structural aspects of it. So the problem context of that is, I guess, a lot of times you can see it all across Canada, and it's kind of a problem across the world, I think, where the global economy operates at such a kind of high level, right? It's really hard for areas that are not these kind of cities or metropolitan hubs to participate in the economy, the global economy. So what you have is brain drain, right? Of young people educated, if they're from rural areas, if they want to have some sort of job or future or livelihood or whatever. Yeah. The pressures of the economy always push further and further and harder towards big city centers and larger scale industrialization, right? That's how the pressure always works. And so for areas like small town areas, areas further from these big city centers, what you have is aging populations, young and educated skilled labor leaving, and people either dependent upon welfare or a lot of kind of social disorder kind of falls into it. You have alternate kind of economic revenues, drugs, and a lot of alcohol abuse and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of social disorder in these areas that you can see all across, well, the globe, I think, but...
Different ways of making money, let's say.
Sure.
Different ways of having a thriving economy.
Or there's a lot of dependence upon the state, and so the state and the market are these huge pressures that really the state can't make up for family, friends, community, right? Like it's not possible to do that. And so what you have then are these areas where all of the people who are living them, the young people like our age, young professionals or whatever, they have the option of stay here where I grew up and not have the possibility of a future or like too much of a livelihood, that kind of thing, or leave. Mm-hmm. And so what I would like to look at is, if they want to leave, great, that's fantastic. I'm not saying anyone has to stay there. But if you don't want that to have to be your option, what are the creative ways of looking at that? What's an economic solution to this problem? What's going into that? So that's what I'm looking at. So what are the things that need to be in place that allow areas to compete in an economic way and sustain their own communities? What are those possibilities? So one example is there's this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So if I could summarize to make sure I'm on the same page, right? We have cities where, if we think of like the high paying or the white collar jobs, are like you go to the city for those jobs. You need, in order to do big level business, engineering, lawyer, all those things, they all happen in the city. Mm-hmm. And so if you live in a small town and then that's what you want to go for, or if that's what society is telling you you should be striving for, you either have the choice of like stop living my dream, stop going for that, or moving out of your small town.
Yeah, so that, and then also, sorry, I feel like this is the worst explanation I've ever given of this.
No, not at all.
The other thing that happens is you get like a one factory town, right?
Right, yes.
So that's where all the jobs are coming from, and then the pressure is always on to compete more and more in the global market. You can get cheaper labor in another country, the factory closes down, everyone loses their job.
Right,
and so that's a really unsustainable economy and community because it's dependent upon one thing.
Right, that makes sense.
And so if that shuts down, everyone either has to leave or go on welfare, and those are the options available.
I'm thinking of the October Sky with the mine.
Sure.
The old movie with Jake Gyllenhaal, they have the mine, and you either work the mine or you leave, and then the mine's going to shut down. So then they're always all worried about basically becoming a ghost town. That's what I'm thinking in my head.
That's exactly the case. Yeah.
Nice.
And so they're all kind of connected, these problems, and the pressure is always from the global markets. How do you compete? And so there's different strategies to how places can compete with a global market. The short answer is you can't really, by trying to do what they're doing, but just not doing it quite as well.
Yeah,
so the option is...
You can't beat a global market in a small town because the whole point is that you're not a global market.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. So the other option is to dig your heels in and create a very place-based economy. Create something that the global market can't produce. So that's the idea. So what can't be produced by, immense industrialization, all these things on the global scale, is very place-specific, craft-cultivated, like champagne, for example. The word is like terroir, right, where it's like in the soil.
Right.
And so that's a strategy to compete, is to do something very, very place-based, because you're not going to be able to compete on these vast spatial scales.
Right, that makes sense. So where you are, how can you do something there that can't be done elsewhere?
Exactly.
Or that can't,
Exactly.
All right. Yeah.
And so one of the examples, a really awesome example, is there's a town, I think it's in Wales, it's called Hay on Wye. It's a small town in Wales. And it was a similar kind of thing, closing, every factory shut down, was going to be people moving, really kind of down. And I think the guy who came up with the idea, his name is Richard Booth, pretty sure. And he came up with the idea to open not one bookstore, but 1,000.
In the town?
In the town.
Okay.
So he bought a castle. I think he was probably well off or whatever, and dubbed himself the king of the castle.
It's always great when you start off by buying a castle.
And had the idea to open thousands of bookstores. And once he did that, everyone was like, oh, this is a really cool thing. What a destination. And so it's become this destination spot for people who read, literary scholars, presenting, because everyone wants to come see it because it's a cool place. And as soon as you have something like that, then pubs open up, bed and breakfast, restaurants. So you have this huge kind of creative kick jump-starting a local economy that's all the other bits kind of come up. Coffee shops, like...
Oh, yeah.
And so...
Are the 1,000 bookstores in the castle?
They're all over the town. It's
all
not
over
just
town.
in the castle.
I mean, that's got to be the only spot in the world where, you would have 1,000 bookstores and you'd have a castle. And
so it's become a huge... That model, the bookstore model, or whatever they call it, has been kind of adapted, and they've set them up in other areas around the world. I think there's one in Sweden or Norway or something, and one in Australia, and it's become this thing of like, what a genius idea. This is really cool. So that's one of the options. The other option is to do the champagne thing, right? It has to be from this region.
Yeah.
Wine's really good at doing stuff like that. Or... Right,
because the water that they use... Is that how it works?
I think it's the grapes.
The grapes that they use? Right, I'm thinking beer. Where it was like the different beer, you have to have specific water in order to get that taste. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Right, like it's you can follow your recipe as close as you want, but it comes down to the water is different. Mm-hmm. And if you don't use that water, you can't have that beer. Or you can't have the exact... And then I guess, same thing with wine and champagne if you don't have those grapes. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
So food is a really, not easy, but it's a concrete example. We see that and we're familiar with it, right?
Yeah, you can only get some food in certain places and you can't replicate it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so he did this with the bookstores, and it's a really great idea. So what I'm wanting to do is to look at so music is a really, traditional music, and I'm using traditional music, what I mean is like Celtic kind of traditional music. So in Canada,
one tradition.
Yeah. So Canadian Celtic traditional music and dance is influenced by a lot of Irish, Scottish, English folk music, fiddle tunes, French, and then First Nations and Métis as well. Mm-hmm. And it's based on this fiddle repertoire, but kind of varies place to place. As you know, you grew up in it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
That kind of music tradition. And so the interesting thing about music, or one of the many interesting things about music, is it creates this ability for you to participate, and specifically with traditional music, which is typically passed on like orally. You don't have to learn notation, so you can hear it, and you don't have to be really good to participate. Like Patch and I both did step dancing growing up, so maybe we can...
I was hoping we wouldn't. I was hoping that wouldn't come up, but...
I thought I'd bring it up.
Yeah.
But you don't have to be great to participate.
No, you don't. The great thing about once you try something is, you'll just be forever given that title. Where I took 4 step dancing lessons, and then there's about a crowd of 100 people, and I still remember it vividly where they all started chanting my name to get up and step dance. And that's just one of those emotional childhood traumas you hope are never brought back up. But
well, there you go.
That's welcome. The beauty of conversations is you bring stuff up like that. That's
talk number 1.
Yeah.
So the features of traditional music are really conducive to bringing people together. Mm-hmm. And the wonderful thing about music too is you can have different perspectives and different points of view, but it creates this space that you're interacting and bonding already. So you don't have to sometimes conversation, if you don't know people or if you disagree a lot, has the ability to bring you together, but also sometimes to divide a little bit, right?
Oh, yeah.
But music is just a really, really great way of generating and building relationships. Mm-hmm. And so specifically with traditional music, there's a really low cost in terms of output of musicians and dancers. Because you need a fiddle. And
you don't need a huge speaker system, fireworks, light show.
Exactly.
You need one person in a space with a fiddle.
Exactly. And you can have a dance, and you can have people coming together, and it's a very, very beautiful and rich tradition as well. And so there are features of these traditional music cultures that are really inhibited by how we operate in kind of modernity. And so what I'm looking at is what are the features that are required to set up these cultures so that you can create like a musical terroir. and reinvigorate bringing people together and set up local communities and local economies that bring together people and reinvigorate these areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. So you're looking at, take the example of the bookstore with the guy Richard Booth, did you say?
I think.
So Richard
I could have
Booth
that wrong.
with his castle. Take his example, how he did that with 1,000 bookstores, and then brought it back to the small town. You're not looking at small towns that have that culture or places that have that culture. You're trying to study how can you bring that culture back. Is that what or you're looking at towns that have that culture, and then also what are maybe identifiable things that produce that culture. So if you were to replicate it, here are like your things that you could do to replicate it.
So, yeah, I think so. I'll just clarify. It's for the purposes of being able to identify what the patterns are.
Right.
So the context will look different. You'll have different regional styles, but what are the features that are the same? What are the underlying patterns? And so I'll give you an example. Sorry, 1 second. I'm going to backtrack a little bit.
No, absolutely.
So what are the patterns that exist in places where it works? And how can you write a how-to guide? And I'll get into Christopher Alexander in a minute.
Yeah.
But so that if you wanted to, say, set something up from scratch, you could also do that. So what does it look like when it's working? And then what are these kind of transferable elements or patterns that exist in these places, so that if you wanted to set up something in your community or town, you could probably do it.
Right. And it doesn't have to be specific to Celtic traditional music. It can be any type of music, any type of traditional music following these patterns. Here's how you do it. Like based on if you go to, I don't know, South America, where you don't have a lot of Irish, Scottish, English people, right? You would basically take the culture of what's there, and then here's how you create that type of community, not with a different style of music, but with their style of music.
Well, I'm not going to say yes to that, because I think that's something I'm interested in looking at for probably the rest of my life. Like,
all right, fair enough. Yeah.
Are there commonalities in human cultures, that extend across human cultures?
Right. Okay.
But I do think that there are features specific. So I'm only looking specifically at this particular type of traditional music.
Right. Okay. Cool.
I don't know, and I wouldn't begin to comment on what exists in a culture that I don't know very much about.
Oh,
if that makes sense.
That's an impressive skill. Not commenting on something that you don't know about.
I mean, I try. I'm an academic after all, but
that's a skill that I need to work on. Not saying things that I don't know anything about, but I like that. All right, that's good.
So one of the examples, because it all just sounds like, okay, but what does that actually mean? What are you talking about? So one of the examples is like different generations getting together really helps to transmit this music. So if you have old people, little kids, teenagers, young adults, middle-aged people, whatever, across the ages, that's a feature that basically has to be there for this music to be transmitted, right?
Right, because then it crosses generations.
It crosses generations. It's also a really good thing because our society is so segregated by age that you have a lot of loneliness, and you've got, while we're diverse in a lot of ways, one of the ways that we're really, really not diverse is across ages, right?
Yeah.
So you have these depletion of relationships that are really necessary for human health and well-being, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's one of the features I really like about this music, because it provides the context and the ability to bring different ages together. And it also really helps if you're learning, helps you to learn it if you're a little kid and you're familiar with all the tunes and stuff growing up, you know it. And then if you're an older person, you can also, develop these relationships, and we all need, we need people across a range of ages.
Oh, absolutely.
Range of ages. And so one of the features is that there's, we have to have spaces where people can get together across generations. And one of the places where this music is often played is in pubs. But the obvious problem with that is anyone under 19 can't get into a pub.
Right, if you're in Canada.
If you're in Canada.
That is, I have traveled, and that is different.
That
is pretty
different.
cool, because it changes the atmosphere of the pub as well. At least the pubs that, so I went to England and Ireland, and it changes the atmosphere of the pub if you have kids in there. I find that people behave adults behave much differently if there are, well, I would say like minors, but that's just because I'm thinking in terms of an age limit. But people behave much differently if families are allowed into pubs. There's, let's say, much more maturity in the crowd in a pub if there are families in there.
Yeah, exactly. There's different atmosphere for sure. And so one of the problems, and this has come up, like speaking with tons of musicians, they'll remember, even in England though too, it's like 18, I think.
Okay. All right.
Or in the UK, I think it's 18.
All right. Not too many places seem to observe that. All right.
But or after a certain hour, if they're not serving
right.
food
Okay.
or
Maybe that's what it was.
know.
I was thinking just going for lunch and then there would just be. But right. I guess we would have that here as well.
Restaurants.
Right? Right. After a certain hour, there's an age limit. That makes sense.
But a lot of them were saying like, oh, I remember, we could go to the pub and listen, and I was so inspired by, X performer who was amazing, or participating in the session. When traditional musicians get together, they call it a session.
Okay.
They just get up and play. It's very informal.
Love it.
And so there's a lot of really informal music sessions that take place in pubs and stuff. So it happens here too, like a bunch around.
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate to grow up in like I don't know if you would call it a culture, maybe a community. I don't like the word community. We're fortunate to grow up in a space where I feel like growing up, we lived a lot of this. Where it was just the cross generations and being able, it wasn't at pubs, but being at homes and people playing music, you'd be invited over and you'd have, grandparents and their kids, and then their great-grandkids playing, and it was just awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there.
No.
Keep going.
Not in the least. And please, if I'm rambling, shut me down.
Not at all. This is fascinating.
Or if it's like, that doesn't make sense, please let me know if something doesn't make sense.
Oh, I will.
So, ages, generations, whatever, one of the problems, musicians, that's it. So musicians, a lot of people I've been talking to have been talking about that aspect of traditional music that they love, that you have different generations. And people remember being able to participate in these sessions when they were little, or being inspired by the older or more advanced musicians. And that's a really important thing, is to have inspiration and to have role models to look up to and to want to be, to be able to have role models,
Absolutely.
But once you have licensing laws that are so strict, you're segregating again. Like, so not only are kids like in school all day with like age segregation, and then all of these events are segregated by age, and so you've got aggressively these aspects of our society that are undermining the possibility for cultivating those relationships, or for cultivating this kind of culture, right?
Right, that is true.
So one of the things, and one of the patterns is then, okay, we need, generations. And so what's a policy thing we could do? Well, what we could do is loosen up on licensing laws, and not promote just, kids drinking. That's not at all what I'm advocating for.
Yeah.
But look at, okay, if there's a space where people are getting together and they want to bring their kids and someone wants to have a pint, that's fine. And we can actually give the responsibility to parents, community, have it at a smaller scale, that kind of, and so just get regulation kind of more appropriate to the scale that it's operating on. There's no need, I shouldn't say there's no need, there are some problems obviously or risks associated with that, might be.
Yeah.
Because it also requires that you're looking out for people, you're not just letting, a lot of people underage drink and get sick and that kind of thing. But that's one of the things, like, okay, that could be done. That's a policy level kind of thing. So I'm trying to identify what are these patterns and what are kind of specific policies we could put in place to look at how to cultivate building these kinds of relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I'm just trying to think, like, even off the top of my head in terms of policy, like I'm just thinking of our general culture right now where it's you turn 19 and then you're allowed in these places after a certain time, you're allowed to consume alcohol. And it's just a bit of a gong show, usually for any 19-year-old in there, because it's the first time for most people. Obviously people get in under the age limit and whatnot, but it's the first time where, for most people, you're allowed in this space, and it's like this it's this forbidden zone that you haven't been allowed into, and then when you finally get into it, like of course it's game on, it's party time because now you're finally there. I'm trying to think in policies, like it's always tough with a policy when you apply it to 8 million, 10 million, 30 million, however many million people, and you just say across the board, here's our rule. But if almost you could if you could be a pub and then apply almost like a two-tier system where it's you're a pub or a bar, and then say I want I don't know, like the family plan where it's open game in terms of age limit, but understanding then the culture that would come with that, right? Like if you're a 19-year-old and you're looking for just a party time, you're not going to go to that place because if that place has a 3-year-old running around in it, you're not going to be able to act the way that you want to if there's kids in it. And so it's basically like, well, you would eliminate, it's not like those groups of people would cross because it would just be known that this is the bar. You don't go to that bar because it's not going to turn into a club at midnight. It's going to be a family party and where they're playing music and all that stuff. And even just thinking about it in terms of that, yeah, I feel like that is one, off the top of my head, that's one policy where you could say I'm a different type of establishment. I'm not a club. I'm not a 19 plus bar. We're this. And then if you say that you're this, the party crowd isn't going to go there because they know that it's families there and they know it's not. Your hookup culture is not going to be in that place because there's families and kids and yeah, it's just not going to be there. But
yeah, no, precisely. I'm a big fan of deregulation. Pretty well.
Even as I'm saying,
deregulation, generally speaking.
Right. Even as I'm saying that, I'm like, you don't really need a policy for that. It would just be better if we didn't have to have those policies. But people love policies, so it's like, all right, that's how we get a second policy in or something.
Yeah. No, people. That's exactly right. People do love policies, and I always am like, okay, what's the policy in place to remove policies? But you rarely see it.
Yeah. Is there a way that we could have people just saying, well, I trust people to make their own? I mean, but then there's the problem with that is that there's always lawsuits and things that come up after that, and yeah.
But that cuts right to the heart of the issue is the understanding of the human person, I think, too, is a huge part of it. And so with the kind of, now this will be a tirade.
Here we go. Good. I'll do my best. Do my best to keep up here.
No, not in that way. Just stop me because I'll just keep
my whiskey's
ranting.
gone. I need another whiskey.
I'll just keep ranting. In modernity, right?
We're calling that the modern world. Is that what you're saying?
From the modern age, yeah.
All right, yeah.
Formation of nation states, rise of capitalism, all of the, things that ushered in the modern era.
Good, I'm glad I clarified that.
So modernity, right? There's this understanding, and in liberal democracies, there's this understanding of the human person as primarily an individual.
Liberal as in not political, liberal as in ideology.
Any kind of democratic nation state.
Like we have. So not liberal as in conservative liberal as in a democratic state.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. There's an understanding of the human person as this primarily kind of autonomous individual, right? Which is, in many respects, a really, really fantastic thing because it allows for a lot of individual rights, which is fantastic. But that idea also allows for has kind of come in, that's not an idea that came in out of a vacuum. It's kind of dependent a lot upon capitalism and upon these large centralized states that we have, that we're only kind of hyper individualized, right?
Right.
And you can see some kind of problems that come from that, of a lot of isolation, a lot of loneliness, all of these kind of problems for the modern era, right?
Yeah.
And it's dependent upon the capitalist economy and centralized states because you have to have rule of law and protect people, and so you want the state to be regulating this, and you need something to fund all of these social systems that are in play, like school, education, all of these things require something to fund them, and so that requires a lot of economic growth.
Right. So if you believe that humans as individuals have specific rights and have to have freedoms to do specific things, you have to have structures in place in order to give them those things, and those structures need funding.
Yes, I should qualify though. I don't think it's just like if you believe humans have rights. I agree that all humans have rights.
Right, yes.
But
yes.
to live as a hyper individualist,
Right.
like we operate in our society now,
Yeah.
requires a lot of these systems in place, right?
Yes.
Like I'm a 30-year-old single woman in academia, and I've traveled all over the world.
Right.
And that, in order for me to do so safely, which I have,
Right. Yes.
really requires a lot of money maintaining these social systems that are in place to
Right.
facilitate this type of life.
To
right?
facilitate the fact that you're 30 years old, in no point in our history would this have ever happened where you're able just to travel all over the
Safely
world.
as a single woman.
Right?
Yes.
You read, yeah, exactly. Like you read books and their big trip was like, I don't know, I'm thinking like Little House on the Prairie where they go 10 kilometers to the nearest town once every like 4 months or something.
Mm-hmm.
And that was their big trip. And then other than, yeah, so as you grow, as you're able to do all these things, you have to have
Yes.
structures in place to
facilitate that.
facilitate it. Yeah.
And those are really, really wonderful things. Just for the record, I'm really happy that
Yeah,
I could
well,
be,
absolutely. Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't have to marry, someone that someone picked for me to marry, or that I can be an academic.
Yeah,
All these
yeah.
kind of things. The difficulty, though, comes with the kind of ecological crises, right, that we're seeing,
Mm-hmm.
and the huge kind of just waste from a lot of this. That type of lifestyle also creates a lot of waste,
Yes.
right? And because it's so dependent on economic growth, there's always that huge push to make more and more and more money, and there's a lot of, well, I guess maybe regardless of what you think about climate change and all that kind of stuff, there is a lot of ecological devastation that we can see as a result of these huge, wide-scale capitalist systems that we're operating in, right?
Right. It would be naive to say that with any system, there are not going to be side effects.
Exactly.
And while we should absolutely acknowledge the benefits of a system where we can see the benefits, it would be naive to say that there are not consequences as well. There are not negative side effects. There are great benefits, but there's also negative side effects.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the huge amount of consumption that our societies do, like
Yeah,
Canada, the U.S., these types of
Yeah, grab
societies,
something, throw it out.
huge amount of consumption, huge amount of waste. So if we're trying to lessen the ecological effects, you start looking at lower growth kind of economic models, or lower growth using yet less kind of waste, that kind of thing. But because this concept of the individual is so tied to the systems that are in place that require huge amounts of money, if we start lessening those systems in place, you want to protect that idea of the individual. You don't want to lose that too.
Yeah, you don't want to take away and then all of a sudden...
Be like, oh, what's going on?
Yeah, yeah, it's madness. It's anarchy out there or something.
Exactly.
You don't want to say, hey, we want everyone to stop consuming stuff, so... And then also, yeah, it would just be madness.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is all a long way of saying one of the options I think available to us is to look at, okay, let's examine, the concept of freedom, or the concept of this, or these concepts, ideas that we operate on in society that we don't even think about,
Mm-hmm.
but like maybe we've got it slightly off. Maybe it looks slightly different. And so when I'm talking about the music stuff, and you're talking about the nightclub and 19 over and versus this kind of thing, I think one of the things, if we want to transition into like a lower growth or less consumer driven society, one of the things that will have to go is some of the funding for state systems.
Yes.
In which case it will become more community based
Right.
regulation, right?
Yeah.
And so you don't necessarily need a policy about, alcohol is a really easy one to look at, but you don't necessarily need a policy about alcohol if you're the one operating the pub and you're really genuinely caring about all the people who are in it, and you know them, and you know the parent, and you have these relationships with people.
Yeah.
And so
Like
policy often takes the place of relationships, right?
Right, that makes sense, because if you have a system where you have hundreds of people going to the same place, it's impossible for you to know everyone. It's impossible to track everyone. Therefore, your only response is, well, if you're buying a drink, you're served a drink. We know that you're all at a certain age, so legalities aside, and then you're punished if the individual makes a mistake. But if you have a small smaller operation, then you're able to say, no, you're having too much. No, this is my rule. These are the policies that I have for my pub, which you can't have if you just have a large scale place.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, you can have it, but it would be more on the place in itself.
I feel absolutely. You're absolutely right. I'm just laughing because I feel like I've gotten so far from
no,
like,
I love
playing
it.
the fiddle, and now we're talking about like individual human rights and
we'll get back there.
But and I think it's always the case where policy just doesn't come out of nowhere, and we see the breakdown of relationships and healthy relationships so strongly in our society, then that requires some policy to make up for the relationships that would be, how do you help people out? What's your responsibility? We have these, responsibilities towards each other to do so. And when we can't do that, then the policy has to step into place, right, to keep people safe.
Yeah.
But we get so used to thinking about, let's have another law, and not thinking about, like, is there another option? What are the other options that don't require quite so much funding to a state? Or is there, laws that are better made by the local level? Like, even just simple things like, policy regarding, what am I trying to think of? Like, environmental policies, right?
Yeah.
The people who know the area really well are the people who live in that area.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to have their input on some of the policy making.
Yeah, I'm thinking of hunting policies where the people that know the area, know the population, they're all working towards it because they all have a vested interest in the population staying high, but also in the fact that they're still able to hunt the population. If you have a governing body who doesn't know about the population and just slaps down a rule, then it's not going to be able to track what is actually good. Like, we'll look at it like, I don't know, like national parks or things like that, where one species is protected, and then because that one species is protected, what does it do to everything else in that system? If you have a huge rise in one species, well then what are the effects that everything else has, versus just letting nature take its course, or the people that know the area maintain it themselves, if that's an example.
No, absolutely. And there's a really fun example that I really like. It's kind of like it because it's snarky, but I think it's a really good example of this. So in Shetland, like the Shetland Islands, right? The
Shetland Islands, which are off the coast of Scotland?
Yeah, 200 kilometers north of Aberdeen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that. You found yourself there.
I did, yeah.
Found yourself there, just happened to be dropping by. But in Shetland.
In Shetland. So the UK made a recycling policy saying you had to meet a certain quota of recycling in an effort to make things more green in the country.
Yeah, so as in a quota of, like, you have to recycle this much stuff.
Yes.
Which basically says that you have to use this much stuff.
Well, that's the thing. It works well for the areas that they were aware of what they were talking about.
Yeah.
Right? And if you're just throwing it out to have recycling quotas, that would be a great thing. Now, I think this is the case. I heard this all anecdotally, so I haven't looked it up. So if this
from
is
a
just a
disgruntled Shetland Islander.
If this is a lie, like I'm.
It's a certain personality that lives on Shetland, I'm sure. So
really great, actually.
Yeah.
But so this policy was put in place that you have to meet a certain quota in an effort to combat waste, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now in Shetland, they're really great with what they do, and everyone's pretty, cares about the environment, a lot of community engagement, all these kinds of things, and it's really, really far from a lot of recycling plants on the mainland UK, right?
Yeah.
So they burnt a lot of things that could be burned, and with that heated up the hot water for areas of Shetland from burning some of the waste.
Yeah.
Really efficient, because otherwise you have to ship it on a barge 200 kilometers south, which uses a lot of gas shipping, and you're shipping that.
Yeah.
So that was a really efficient thing. And because they were quite green in their operation already, they weren't throwing things away, and they weren't throwing them into recycling because they'd reuse them.
Right.
So they weren't hitting the quota. So in order to hit the quota without having negative side effects, they had to start throwing away more stuff in the recycling to get shipped down and processed.
Right.
And it just was like...
Where it just becomes this backwards system.
Yes.
Where, yeah.
So the policy, good in itself if you're thinking about a specific, area or ways of operating, but not taking into consideration outlier modes of operation or different cultural dynamics or that kind of thing.
Rather than keeping this glass jar and using it for something, I need to recycle it because I need to hit my recycling quota.
Yes.
So rather than reusing the thing, I need to throw it out, ship it back, have it boiled down or whatever, turned into something else, then have it shipped back here, then reuse it.
And it's just bad.
6 months, a year later, rather than just washing it and keeping it.
Yeah. And so the policy is a good thing and well-intentioned and really fantastic.
Yeah.
But because the scale of the country that you're making things there's so much variation that these policies often just are, okay, what's going on here? How do you account for this kind of stuff? And so what I really like is when policies are really great, laws are great.
Yeah.
You can't have people doing illegal things, and in that sense I think fantastic. Have laws across, the nation.
Oh yeah.
Really fantastic. But for things like environmental stuff or, different kinds of things, sometimes the people who live in an area actually do know better,
Yes.
And so what is the proper scale of regulation?
Right. That makes sense.
How do we get on there?
I don't know. To tie it all, to bring it back, it comes down to, local communities again. That's, I believe, how we got there. So it's the local community being responsible in their own way. And then that relates back to music because you have cross generations. I'm just trying to work this back in my head how we got there. But local communities being responsible works back to music and cross generations being able to interact, which comes from different policies, which policies that are put in place to protect people, but then also have those side effects of limiting those interactions. That's how we got there.
There you go. Well done.
There we go. That was
I panicked there. I was like, oh shoot.
Hey, that's all right. That's how we got there. I knew there was a way. I just had to jump it back. Yeah. Let's dive back then more into the study. What have you, in terms of the music, right? Because you're talking about how to keep people, not keep people, but what can rural communities do to allow people to have that choice between urban versus rural? Because a lot of times there isn't that choice. It's like I have to leave to be able to do something. To be this person, I must move out. To have this certain lifestyle, I must leave this place because there's nothing for me here. So music allows people that choice of what do I want? Can I stay here? Can I go somewhere else? I have that freedom of being able to choose versus I have to leave, and you don't have a freedom of choice.
Essentially,
yeah. So what have you found in terms of music? So it's that folk tradition, and then how does music bring that about?
Yeah, fair enough. So as you were repeating that, I was like, I'm missing the key kind of bit of information that's required for this to actually make sense and not just sound like, mindless feel-goodery.
No, I wouldn't say that. Everything right now so far has made a lot of sense.
But
I'm a little impressed at how you came to all of this. But yeah, that minor piece that's missing out.
Yeah, so one of the key things, when you are trying to establish a local community, I also hate the word community. I don't hate it, but I think it's used and not defined a lot.
I don't like community because it feels, with all these policies and everything, we're all talking top down. It feels like there's a plan in place, and as soon as you throw the word community, it's like networking. I don't like the word networking because then it's I'm using people. They're part of my network now. Where it's no, they're either friends or they're people you know. But if you're using someone, then it's your network, right? It's I'm going to this party to network. No, you're not. You're going to this party to meet people. And if you want to meet people, if you care about those people, then hopefully they'll become your friends.
Yeah.
I get that you have to have a term networking to explain a certain relationship that you have with someone. It's the same thing with community versus just friends or my friend group. It feels forced in a way. It feels too controlled and usury. We're going to start a community always feels kind of weird and cultish versus I've got a great group of friends. Or anyways, that's my rant. That's my rant with community and networking. Two words I don't like to ever use. Friends and family. That's what I would say.
In that sense, I kind of like the word community because I think it denotes people who you kind of know, kind of live in the same area. You don't have to be best friends with everyone because I think that's not possible sometimes.
That's true.
And so there's maybe have similar interests, and you get together and you do things of similar interests and you hopefully become friends and develop these relationships and that kind of thing.
That's a fair point. I stand corrected on that.
But I'm not correcting.
No, that's a fair point.
Let me tell you why I disagree.
Something that is a fair point because if you say friends, then it implies a certain relationship, but you might not have that friendship. Yep, that's a fair point.
But my problem with the word community is people often use it and then I think community entails responsibility and love and caring. Those are things that should be entailed when you use that word. I have a responsibility to, these other people that I'm interacting with. Whereas often I think it's just thrown about like, I want community. And you're like, well, yeah, but you can build it, Yeah. You can do things to make sure that you're cultivating that.
Two people make a community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The connection. Okay. So if an area, or if you're trying to establish a local economy in some way, or create a business or that kind of thing, what you need are people being around, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing we are quite often missing. Everyone operates in these kind of trajectories that don't quite often interact all the time. And so one way to make sure that you can sell beer, we're talking about alcohol, so we'll continue that train here. You can't sell it if there's no one there. Right? You can't run a hotel if there's no one in the hotel.
Right.
You can't do any number of things if there aren't people there and don't want to spend time there.
Right.
But if you have, say, a live music event where people are coming and engaging and wanting to participate, they can then buy a beer from a craft brewery. That was another pattern that showed up quite a bit, is craft local breweries. And those are really, really important.
Yeah.
They can buy a beer, and if they're having a beer, they're standing and chatting. Or they can get food. Hugely important thing to make sure arts and food are very, very deeply interlocked.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what you need is people actually being there and people actually having relationships with each other. And so the music part of that really helps to establish those relationships. And once you have people in an area, then the rest can unfold.
Then the rest can come.
Right? And and then also you get, some tourism and get people coming and there's that whole aspect of it as well, because when you see really, I'm going to use the forbidden word authentic, because there's lots of debate as to what authentic actually means.
Yeah.
When you see something cool, you want to participate and look at it and be a part of it.
Yeah.
And so you come to see it as well, and then you're spending money in this town and buying souvenirs and doing this kind of stuff. But the biggest connecting thing is, how does the music work? It actually makes people speak to each other. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense, because you have a draw that people go to,
mm-hmm.
people interact with it, because that's the big thing too, right? It's not just one thing, but it's the thing that it makes you go, and then you interact with
mm-hmm.
it as well, right? Even if it's, sure, you're playing, singing, you're stomping your foot, everyone's swaying along to it. It's all interactions. Yeah, so that is the draw, and then from that, everything else comes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so that's just one example, like with one live music event. But if you've got many, right? Because part of it is you don't just want to have one event and then it's done.
Right. You don't want to have one bookstore.
Exactly. You want 1,000.
You want 1,000
exactly.
bookstores. What a guy.
Isn't that the coolest thing?
I'm boggled at what these bookstores look like, and I'm just picturing like 1,000 little... Have you ever been in Toronto where they have those little doors where it's like give a book, take a book? Yeah. I'm picturing like 1,000 of those. Obviously it was probably a bit nicer. I'm picturing like 1,000 give a book, take a books, and I was like, that wouldn't attract me, but I'm just thinking of the infrastructure to have 1,000 bookstores.
Like, it's awesome. Look it up. You'll have to. I'll show you later.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to. Like, is it 1,000 different buildings?
Yeah, Yeah, it's just
That's
all
incredible.
of these buildings. So, like, let's say these houses and
Yeah.
the window here.
Yeah.
That would be a bookstore. That would be a bookstore. That would be a bookstore.
And do they all have a different theme, or they're all just bookstores?
I haven't looked.
And then it just becomes this huge, we're going to go, everyone's got their Instagram stories going and selfie sticks out.
They've got people giving, doing readings of their books they've just published.
Yeah.
They've got, it's become this, like, huge
Yeah,
thing
book
that
tour.
people
Things
want
like
to-
those are funny. Like, you just find these random things, like butter tart tours, right? Where it's like, how random is that? But you have people coming up from the States, driving like 20 hours, and it's like, oh, we're going on the butter tart tour, and there's 30 butter tart places. But yeah, things like that where it's, I mean, I just never think of these things. Butter tart tours, 1,000 bookstores.
Yeah.
Music
no,
events.
It's so the music thing, like, I just love it. I love live music, and that's
Yeah.
a really fun thing and best job ever to go to live music events and talk to people, and that's my job. So it doesn't get
You can't really beat that. It sounds
like
great.
it's about the easiest job ever. So that's really nice. But when you have all these other events, so another one of the patterns that shows up is like different levels of scale, right?
Okay.
So you can't just have one kid. I mean, it's great if there's a kid at home practicing the violin or something. That's fantastic. But that's obviously not all that's required for a music culture. Is
Right.
one kid in
Yes.
isolation.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you just have an arena where professionals come and play,
You also won't have that.
you also won't have that because that's just the top level, huge scale,
Yeah.
and top high caliber musicians. Another thing is like gradients, like levels of ability and age, and there's all these
Yeah.
different.
Well, there's
gradients.
also a disconnect too, right? If you go to a concert, there's a disconnect between you and the music,
Mhm.
where, like, versus a pub. I'm trying to think of like sing along at a pub. Guy playing the guitar. No lights, no flash, but you can sing along with it,
Mhm.
and you are part of the music. Whereas if you're at a concert, yeah, you can sing along, but you're not part of it. You're just watching it. And you need to have both of those things for, I mean, it's really cool to be able to go in the light show and, the best in the world and watch them.
Yeah.
But you also need to have you being part of it as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it comes back to our conversation earlier about, are we just primarily only individuals?
Yeah.
Or are we connected to other people in relationships?
Yeah.
And so that's a really good case in point. Like, if you're going to, I don't know, who's a pop star? Take any number of...
Ariana Grande, she's pretty great.
I was
we
thinking of
go.
her, and I was like, yeah.
Big Ariana Grande fan.
And that's a fantastic thing. I would love to go to an Ariana Grande concert. I love live music and I love giant concerts. They're really fun.
Yeah, I'd go
But
Ariana Grande, Taylor Swift. Probably be my 1 and 2 options. Maybe Drake. Drake would be my 3.
That would be fun.
Those would be my top 3 probably.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's others. Probably get made fun of by all my friends for this, but I'm sure there's others out there that I'm not thinking of right now. I got one friend who will say Coldplay because he always just preaches about Coldplay. But
Oh, really?
yeah, Ben,
Oh.
you should get Ben to tell you about his Coldplay concert experience. He went, I think it was at the Rogers Center for the next 3 years. Anything you talked about with him was, well, when I was at Coldplay. And
Nice.
anyways, that's a
Nice.
side note.
That's great.
I know he'll listen to
Get a
this.
good dig in.
He'll listen to this and get a good laugh. I should also shout out Ben Corcoran and the Protagonist guys because they're the inspiration for this. I just love listening to podcasts, and they've started podcasts and listening along and all these cool conversations that they have. And so, yeah, I was like, man, this is cool. I got to do it. So it's shout out to the Protagonist boys, Ben, Pete, and Joel. You guys are inspiration. I know I'm copying you, but it's all right. There's nothing wrong with that because now I get to have part of these conversations. Anyways, side note, shout out to those guys, but let's get back on track here.
Yeah, not a problem.
What were we talking? Interacting with music.
Yeah, so levels of scale being one of them. And so you're an individual at a concert. Great. Fantastic event. But exactly like you're saying, you're not participating in the same way. It's a different kind of participation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that's really important is to have different scaled events
Mm-hmm.
so that you can have, a kitchen party. That's a fantastic thing. People playing in your house, whatever, that's a great thing.
We've been to a lot of those. They're probably some of the best times you can ever have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean,
Super fun.
we're fortunate enough to know incredible musicians. So the people that you're seeing at the kitchen party are also up on those stages.
Yeah, really high
Which
caliber.
is then it's the high caliber plus you're interacting with it. But whether it's, I mean, even our own family, like we'll play music, and I mean I'm usually more of the observer, trying to break that role, but yeah, it's something about just a kitchen party that, yeah, you just can't beat it.
Exactly.
You just really can't beat it.
It's fantastic. Another thing though that is required is like busking on the street corner or playing in medium-sized venues, say.
Mhm.
And so you have these different levels of scale that all encourage each other. So if you're out, you're playing in a medium-sized kind of venue, a pub or a like a community hall or something.
Yeah.
And then that event ends and you're kind of hyped up and you're like, oh, we should have, a party and everyone come back after, do this kind of thing. So you've got all these different events
Right.
that really foster and help cultivate each of the other events at different sizes, levels of scale, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so typically the problem is our societies are really good at kind of wiping out those smaller scaled things.
Yeah.
And favoring these kind of giant institutions.
Right.
And so what is it we can do to try and cultivate and reestablish these kind of smaller nested levels of scale for community events or larger regional events or household events and all of these kind of things. But
yeah. Wow.
yeah, so that's how it connects. You have people coming together, and that's that's the
No,
money
absolutely.
maker, if that makes sense.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, where's this taken you? Like you said, the Shetland Islands, Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you say? 200 miles off the coast of Scotland?
It's 200 kilometers
200
north of
kilometers.
Aberdeen, Aberdeen's not quite at the tip, but pretty far north in Scotland.
And it's an island?
A group of islands.
That's
Yeah. The population is 23,000
Scotland.
people.
So okay, that's way up there.
It took 14 hours on the ferry.
14 hours, that can't be a calm ferry ride either. I'm just trying to picture like that's north. Those have got to be insane waves. That's got to be freezing.
My first ferry ride, I get really, really seasick. I get seasick sitting on a hammock.
Yeah, 14 hours?
Anyway,
My
the
God.
first ferry ride up, the captain of the boat, he gets on the announcer and he's just like, it's going to be pretty calm seas and pretty good weather, etc., but just to warn you, the boat will be pitching between the hours of 2 and 5.
What does that
Pitching?
up and down or side to side?
I
Or,
was like, I don't know what he meant by it. I don't know what the
it's
exact
not a good sound though.
naval definition is, but I was like, that's not the
you
that's not the word you want to
You want
hear.
4 gravels in you and to be knocked out at that point.
So it's pretty far north. It's a phenomenal place.
So what were you looking up there? Is there a community, a culture,
So they have a really vibrant traditional music scene up there.
Okay.
And I won a research grant to go there, so that was really
That's sweet.
pretty sweet.
Yeah.
And
When you say one, how does you apply
I applied, yeah.
and compete based on an application?
Kind of, yeah. I sent in the application, and it was really fantastic. Actually, funded by MyTax, which is a great funding agency to support a lot of research. And
Nice.
so I wrote the application. They liked it, and they said, "Yeah, fantastic. Go ahead."
That's
here it is."
fantastic. Good for you.
So that was fantastic, and yeah, the Shetland Islands, or Shetland as they call it.
Shetland. We would call it the Shetland Islands, but they would just call it Shetland.
Shetland, yeah.
Right.
So I would call it Shetland now, having been there.
Now being a local Shetlander.
A Shetlander.
All right.
It's a population of 23,000 people. And Lerwick is the biggest. Okay, Lerwick is the biggest town, and its population is about 11,000 in the larger Lerwick area.
Okay.
And then the rest of the other 12,000 people are in various other islands around. And I think there's an island called Beresford, which is like a 5-minute ferry ride from the mainland.
Right.
Shetland.
The mainland, which is 200 kilometers away from
And
Scotland.
you get everywhere by ferry, and it's no trees, totally wild.
That's
super
wild.
super windswept, like crazy wind, unbelievable wind.
Yeah, I'm just picturing I don't know, those those English movies where it's like just crazy rain and just rock on the cliff and it's insane wind and the umbrellas are going out, inside out. That's what I'm just picturing. in my
That's pretty
head.
accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, sheep. I just finished the James Harriet.
Nice.
Did you see the new one? Anyways, it's sheep on basically eating a rock with like a little bit of grass off of it and that sort of stuff. But yeah.
Well, there is like the hills are really nice and it's pretty.
Is this where Shetland ponies come from?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
The show Shetland. Have you seen it on Netflix?
I've seen it. I never watched it. Like
Okay.
I've seen the
That's
name,
where it's
but
filmed.
okay, cool.
I was watching it the other day. Actually, I was like, "This is so cool."
That is
I
cool.
Remember, like what these buildings smell like that they're filming it in, or the atmosphere, or whatever.
That's sweet.
So won this grant, went up there because they've got a really vibrant traditional music scene. The Shetland tradition is really, really strong. It's a cool culture up there because it was originally Viking culture, and then it was given to Scotland as part of a dowry about 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Some Danish Viking, I guess not Danish, some Viking person married some Scottish person, and
Yeah.
the islands were given as a dowry to
Dang.
Scotland.
Think of that, eh?
So
Here's a few of my islands.
so there's a huge Viking influence.
Okay.
And so they speak a dialect, it's called Shetland dialect, and which is a kind of amalgamation of a bunch of different kind of languages,
Yeah.
but mostly English and a lot of Viking kind of
Yeah, it's cool.
stuff thrown in
Yeah.
there, and all the street names are like Viking based. It's there's a huge Viking influence, and also Scottish as well, of course.
Yeah.
But really kind of unique culture, and they have a really vibrant traditional music culture up there. And so I went to speak to musicians, music teachers, local business owners, anyone who's arts agencies. The head of economic development for the islands. He was really, really fantastic.
How many people? 12,000 you said on the main island?
More on the main island because it's bigger, but in the city, and the biggest city is Larwick.
Okay.
And in the city and its larger kind of suburb areas, I think is 11,000.
11,
Everyone
okay.
knew me.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. It's like
Right.
it's big enough that you have a city, stores, all that stuff. But yeah, okay, cool.
Mm-hmm. And so I went to talk to basically anyone connected in any way to the arts and music scene, and economic development, policymakers, that kind of thing, to see what's going on when it works, what makes it work, and what are the things that you would also maybe change to make it work better. To
Mhm.
identify, okay, what are the features that make it work? What are the patterns that exist? And how can we encourage this? So I lived there for 4 months over the winter of 2019, 2020.
Over the winter, eh? Yee.
It was pretty dark.
Yeah.
It's like up near the 60th parallel, so it's really far north.
Yeah.
So the days are really, really short in the winter.
Yeah.
But
4 months though?
yeah, so
Is
I
that what you
was
said?
in Scotland for 5 months, but I was in Aberdeen, based at the University of Aberdeen for a month before I went up to Shetland, and then was in Shetland for 4 months.
Can you
So-
speak any Shetland? Can you say a few words for us on the show?
Well, Peary,
What does that mean?
P-E-E-R-I-E means little.
Peary?
Like a
Like a-
little kid or a period kid. I was at a
Okay.
music night one night. Actually.
Is that supposed to be English? Or is it just like their
It's just
word?
one of the words.
Just one of the words.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I was at a party one night, and everyone was super kind, and they invited me to lots of things all the time, and so
Yeah.
was
Again, part of the hospitality, the community, the culture.
Exactly. Really, really fantastic. So I was at a music night one night, this party, and they also call everyone wife. Like
Okay.
women, married or not married.
It's just wife.
Wife.
Okay.
And so someone,
What if you are married and you're referring to someone else?
also
No.
wife.
Also
But
wife.
women, it's just a
What do you call-
transferable word.
What would you call your own wife?
My wife.
So, okay. So just across the board, wife.
Yeah, it's just this word. And someone was saying to me, someone referred to me as a bonny lass, and then said, that Peary wife over there isn't married, and I didn't, catch on either of them, because I was
That
just...
little wife over there isn't married. That's funny.
That Peary wife. And I just didn't catch, because I was, starting to pick it up or whatever, and then I realized, oh, this is kind of cool. I've been here long enough that these
Yeah.
words are starting to,
Yeah.
become part of my vocabulary. This is fantastic. I'm
Nice.
trying to think of other words. I don't know. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no, that's cool. I don't know, Peary wife. Yeah. I mean, that's it. How did you how do you discover Shetland? Like, how do you discover these things? So, take me back to square one, right? Like you, Shetland, all this stuff, this community, super cool. Richard Booth, 1,000 bookstores, castle. How do you get into all of this? Like, I'm assuming, like, so we come from a very vibrant, let's call it community, I guess we could say, community. A lot of traditional music. Again, it's like, yeah, Celtic folk music from Cape Breton, I would say. Is that correct? Like a lot of the music around here is Cape Breton influenced, which is, again, I believe, Scotland influenced. Is that right?
Yeah, but also Ontario.
Ontario,
like
okay.
The step dancing we did, Patrick did.
Right, yeah, my step dancing career
is an Ontario style.
Yeah.
That came out of like the logging camps in the Ottawa Valley. That's that style. So the Ontario Celtic music as well.
Okay.
But yes, a lot of Cape Breton influence too.
How did you get into like this? Like, how did you get to this topic?
Yeah, well, that's a good question.
Is it something that, like, you open up a door and then the other side of the door is another door and then you just keep going through it, and then as you go through it you're like all of a sudden 100 doors in? Like, yeah, is that how it works? Or
yeah, basically. So I applied to do my PhD. I was doing my master's, and I've always been really interested in stories, kind of that interplay between literature and philosophy, and stories and literary theory or philosophy of language, that kind of space. What's going on here?
Yeah.
You know, as well as political philosophy. I really, really enjoy that. And when I was doing my master's, I wrote my thesis on environmental philosophy, looking at what are the influences of earlier philosophers on the environmental philosophy texts we see now. Because I also really like that kind of nature aspect.
Yeah,
you know?
What are the environmental texts that we see now? What are they?
Like, just different, like, if you're writing environmental theories on, like, what's the human species? Is the human species a plague on the earth? Is there problems that come from how we operate? These kind of different philosophical environmental texts.
Right, okay. So things that I'm thinking about. Like, when I hear environment, I'm thinking, like, climate change.
Yeah,
humans,
or that too.
Interaction with land, like that sort of stuff. So
that kind of stuff,
those theories that are now relevant in today, what was the influence from, let's say, 100, 200, 300 years ago? What's the influence that those people had on the theories of today?
Who are the ideas they're reading?
Yeah.
Is this guy who's talking?
The people that make ideas now read someone to get those ideas.
Yeah, or they adopted a different kind of philosophy, right? Like,
read two different people, disagreed with both of them, and came up with their own idea.
Sure, exactly. So so what I was doing was like, okay, these are the main bodies of environmental philosophy or environmental literature. And as far as I can see, this group really draws on, like, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, or this group draws on the philosophy of this person, and that's what I was really interested in, because I love nature writing and this kind of play of environment, philosophy, literature, politics, that kind of stuff. So when I was applying to do my PhD, I met my PhD supervisor actually a couple of years ago at a music camp in this area, and I thought, he sounds really... I like what he's talking about. I would like to study with that man.
Yeah.
That was before I even applied to do my master's. And then when I was doing my master's...
Is that the Leahy Music Camp?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool he was there. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so that's how I knew he existed. And then when I was doing my master's, I initially thought I wanted to study kind of more ancient stuff. Like... ancient philosophy, that kind of stuff,
and then we're going Socrates, Aristotle,
that kind of thing.
Those dudes,
which I do enjoy, but I'm not a like.
You don't want to put yourself as. You don't want to say I'm an Aristotelian. Is what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying anyone who is a philosopher.
There's no knock on them.
No. I'm not. I do not have their expertise. Is what I'm saying. I am not.
Yeah.
You know,
no,
I enjoy it, but I'm not. I'm not an expert in that way in any.
You can tell me what the form of a table is, but that's about it, right? Is that
no?
Is that what we're out here? Accidents and substances and.
No, I really enjoy it, but I'm not an expert in that area. But more and more, I realized I was really interested in the environmental stuff and kind of quite passionate about that. And then when I was thinking of different PhD ideas, I was thinking of, okay, language really influences how we cultivate and how we operate in places. And the language that we use really, really helps us to either see things or mask from us things that are going, but it really, how we inhabit places really depends a lot on the language that we use. And I'm really, really interested in that as well. So for example, if you've got a regional name for something and you see it, how am I going to backtrack this? Once you have a name for something and you're seeing it and then it becomes a part of your repertoire of how you operate, you then start to see it, right? If you have a yellow car, you then start to see tons of yellow cars.
Right, yeah.
And so if you have the name for this kind of specific kind of wetland or marsh or swamp or whatever, you'll start to notice them.
Then you start to notice them.
And when you start to notice them, you often care about them, care about what happens, become interested and engage, and you form relationships with these places, right?
Yeah. We see maple trees all over because we're always thinking about the maple leaf and everything.
Exactly, exactly. And so the language that we use really can strengthen or detract from our relationships with these kinds of things, right?
Okay.
And
Can you give me an example of a...
I'm trying to think of one, but...
detraction one. Or would that be more like self-talk towards something?
So an example would be maybe...
Not self-talk towards yourself, I should say. But negative speech towards a certain thing. Therefore, you start to have just negative interactions with that thing.
Maybe that, but also I was thinking, if you're not learning what the trees and the plants and the animals are in your area, you won't see them, you won't notice, and you won't care.
Right, that's fair.
So if you have, if you just talk about it like, oh, that's all swamp, and there's no kind of differentiation towards different types of wetlands,
right,
you won't care about what's going on in them.
That's all swamp, let's learn about the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah.
Then you're just going to write what you have off as all swamp. And when you go to the Amazon rainforest, even if you see a swamp, you think it's really cool.
Or not care.
It's not a swamp. Right.
Or not care if, we're going to make this swamp into a parking lot. You're like, oh, that doesn't matter because
it's just a swamp.
That's not, there's nothing unique about that.
Whatever. Nothing lives in there. No animals live in there.
Exactly.
Yeah, it doesn't help. Okay,
exactly.
I get what you're saying.
Does that make sense? So
that does make sense.
I kind of thought I wanted to look at something about that, of language and how that influences how we operate and how that can really help environmental kind of causes and encourage ecological kind of conscience formation in people. And then I was talking to my potential supervisor, who's now my supervisor at this point, and he was like, yeah, that sounds really good. But what do you think about music? Like, do you know anything about music? And I was like, yeah, I do actually. And he's like, I think, the language thing, that's a really good thing, but it might be a hard sell. So it was a really pragmatic transition.
Yeah, no.
He said, I think people can get on board with music because it makes sense. And I don't know that people will get on board with what you're saying. I agree, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's a harder sell. And I said, yeah. And he's like, why don't you just look at the same thing, but incorporate music? And so I said, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. I'm actually had a lot of musical training and know this kind of stuff really, really well. Mm-hmm. And then started reading more into that area and just kind of meandered and it evolved along the way. That was a really long explanation.
No, not at all.
That's how that all kind of came
That's
up.
super cool. That makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
Where else have you, so like Scotland, you mentioned PEI before, Cape Breton, have you ever been up there?
Yeah, Cape Breton, I was there for a bit, which was fantastic. Really, really fantastic. I'd love to go back. Was intending to go back, but things got shut down the following summer. I was going to go back to both PEI and Cape Breton, but things were closed down the last couple of years. But Cape Breton, PEI, throughout Ontario, which has been really fantastic. And then, those were mostly the research trips for those areas. Yeah.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Do you play any music? Well, sorry, I shouldn't ask that. I do know you play music. We were both trained, because this is one of those things that I've been thinking about, and I know it's probably not your area of expertise, but classical versus non-classical types of training in music. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, and what are you also currently playing? Yeah,
so I am, as you said, we were trained. Very, very well trained by a fantastic music teacher.
Yeah, just kidding.
And you can't argue with results. We won every
I can't.
every competition.
I give her that.
And that was not us being good students. That was her being.
That was her. There was only so much. Yeah.
No, so I have my. Oh, the battery's running out here. I have my grade 8 piano with the Royal Conservatory, like classic training, as you know.
And for anyone who doesn't know, that's pretty good. That's very good.
And did music theory as well. And I really, really, really like classical training. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think music theory is a really fantastic thing. Also did step dancing for many, many years, which I love, and I still do all of the time without noticing, and just kind of dance around. And then have, just kind of various different instruments around. And this summer was jamming a lot with our brother and sister playing the guitar, and so I've been playing the guitar a little bit lately, and a little bit of fiddle and that kind of thing. But I don't play as much as I should by any means. Mm-hmm. But every once in a while I'll pick up the guitar or ukulele or something and write and play something. But was really enjoying this summer jamming almost every night, and that was really, really fun. But yeah, so that's kind of my musical, and then a lot of choir singing as well. Actually, so a ton.
Of choir singing?
Of musical training.
Musical training. Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I think that classical training is fantastic. I also do think that there's a lot of value in oral music training and informal music stuff. And I think if you say this is better, don't do this or don't do this, that's not a helpful thing. But immersing people in different types of experiences and having different types of learning is a really, really helpful thing. That's what I think about that.
Nice. I like it. Mm-hmm. This is probably a good time to wrap it up. I feel like I've got a ton more questions, and we could go on for another couple hours, but